So this is Blastoise. We know him, we love him, he's an OG, a goat, or a turtle. But this is also, somehow, Blastoise. So today we're gonna sculpt a Blastoise that is entirely too realistic because I can and I want to. Alright, so the first thing we have to do is give this turtle a spooky, scary skeleton. With 2 pieces of wire, I bend them where I want the knees to go and twist them together until they're nice and stable so I can separate them again at the top to make the arms. We're gonna need to bulk out his form with some aluminum foil since I want him to be quite the substantial lad. Once I got enough foil on his torso, I cover it with clay and repeat the process for his legs. And as for his arms, I ended up not using any foil since they really didn't need as much bulk. Now after a bit of blending and shaping, mostly with my fingers, we have a rough form going, and that means that I can start blocking in some more detail. I personally like to start with the feet, don't take that out of context, and so the first thing I do is roll up a bunch of little Tic Tacs and attach them to his legs. By the time I gave him some kneecaps, our nails were out of the oven, and I pushed one into each toe, adding some clay over top of the nails to make them look a bit more realistic. Now I made a bunch of different sizes for these nails, so I chose the best nail for each turtle toe. Once all of his toenails were in, I blended in some clay between his toes to give him the webbed feet that any turtle should have. And once it was all blended in, I began working my way up. Now turtles have a lot of wrinkles and loose skin, and I noticed that typically you'll see them have skin that almost folds over directly onto their feet, so I tried mimicking that as best I could. Once his legs were looking very, majestic, I could start working on his shell. Now originally when I got to the point of working on his stomach shell, I kind of preferred the look of a much wider one, so I made this shield-esque shaped piece of clay and attached it to his stomach without much further thought. This will come back to bite me in a little bit, but before then I can at least practice making the skin wrinkled where it connects to his shell. Now once I got 3/4 of the way there, however, I realized I did not like this pose very much and I thought of something cooler, but the shell got in the way of that. So I ripped it off and began reshaping him. I narrowed his shoulders a little bit and added more of a hunchback. Once I was happy with the pose, I began cutting out our new shell, which was a lot smaller and based off of an alligator snapping turtle. This shell thankfully fit like a glove, so I added some side pieces that would eventually connect this front shell to the back shell. Now I got distracted for a minute by his hands. The whole not having fingers thing was bugging me and probably bugging him too. But once I got his fingers separated, I was satisfied for the time being and went back to adding a bunch of wrinkles around his shell. I tried my best to make them feel natural in the direction they went, so once I laid down a bunch of clay noodles, I started blending them in and adjusting them as needed. Alright, so it's looking pretty good in the sense that the wrinkles are going in the direction they should be, but they are not smooth at all. So let's finish those turtle hands so we can make this guy silky smooth. His hands were pretty much the same as his feet, but I wanted him to look pretty fierce, so I did use longer claws for this part. Now once the claws were all in, I pushed back the clay at the base of the nail to create almost like a cuticle to make it look more natural. And here's a little before and after giving him the manicure. It's subtle, but I think they look less like sausages when I do this. I'm gonna push back his cuticles on this side too, and now it's time for the very satisfying part of smoothing out all the work we've done with some acetone to make him look not so rough. And with all of it smoothed out, all the details we added are a lot more readable. You can really appreciate the wrinklage after that step. And now we can start adding the plates of the stomach shell. Basically, I'm just going to be dividing it into a bunch of sections with one of my sculpting tools. Once I liked the placement of all these sections, I went around and smoothed out the edges until it looked a bit more natural. I did a once over with a little silicone tool, and finally I hit it with some acetone to really smooth out any areas I missed. And now it's time for the part I'm most excited for, which is sculpting the head. I'm taking pretty much the last of my wire and sticking it into Blastoise's neck, sorry about that, and then a giant oval of clay is pressed into it and generously blended into the shoulders for extra support. Once it was nice and sturdy on the body, I used one of my sculpting tools to mark where I want his mouth to be and used an X-Acto knife to cut out that large section of clay. And with the shape of his head finally being a bit more fleshed out, I slimmed down his face on the sides and began smoothing things out on the inside of his mouth. From there, I can start adding more realistic features to the rest of his head. Now, much like his nails, I pre-baked a few differently sized eyeballs to see which ones suited him the most, and I ended up going with the smaller ones. I pressed one in on each side of his head and began slowly adding strips of clay around it until they started to look like they were actually inside of his head. Once they start to take shape, I can work on his ears, and for those, I'm gonna add 2 horns on either side, with the bigger horn having the opening of his ear. And once those were both on and blended in, I had enough detail for the time being to work on his many neck wrinkles. I used a ball stylus to add indents all around his neck and used noodles of clay on top of the areas between those ridges to give it a lot more volume. As I went, I blended them in somewhat to make sure they were looking good, but there's nothing like the power of good old chemicals to smooth things out a bit more. So once I was happy with the general shape of them, I went in with more acetone until everything looked super smooth. Once the neck was done, I'm going back to the head to start really honing in on the details and making sure the shape of the head looks right. Now with the eyes and face really taking shape, I'm gonna work on the inside of the mouth before I add any more detail to the rest of the head, except for this nose I'm adding right now, just because I don't want to smush it down by accident. I make his cheeks all wrinkly and add some indents on his upper jaw, and he doesn't have any teeth, but that isn't an excuse to not be intriguingly scary and gross, so I make sure to add sufficient bumps to his tongue to up the realism just a bit. He looks like a shriveled up mole rat. He's perfect. Now he isn't gonna be smooth for long, we'll be adding a lot of texture to him in a moment, but first I want to get the form of his shell as well as his tail all ready to go. I'll add a cone of clay for his tail and add some folds and wrinkles to blend it in with the rest of his body. And with the tail on, I can finally use a really long, thick noodle of clay to work as my shell border. Once I get it to the right shape, I'll fill any blank spaces up with clay and smooth all of it together. And with that, the shell is on. Right now the borders of it are flipped up just a little bit, so I have enough room to add Blastoise's water pumps. Once I get those pumps on, we can fold it back down so it looks more natural, but for the time being, pay it no mind. Like any good turtle, he needs to be given a weapon. For his water pumps, I thought the best idea would be to make them oversized barnacles. I also considered making them tube sea sponges, but barnacles felt more right. For these pumps, I added a cone of clay to each shoulder and carved them out so they're hollow. I'm using this picture of a barnacle as my main reference. They have a lot of cool textures and patterns going on, so I'm gonna try my best to mimic them. I'll add a couple triangular plates of clay to each one and blend them together. And as I was doing this, it felt kind of barren where the barnacle meets Blastoise's skin, so I decided to add some wrinkles around them so they looked more like they were growing out of his body. With the general form of his water pumps done, I fold the shell back down so I can start detailing it. Now, even though we're making this anime turtle too realistic for his own good, I want to remain true true to some aspects of Blastoise's original design, so I made sure to divide his shell just like it is originally. Then I go back and make the divide between each section a bit bigger and smoother so I can start adding in some more volume to his shell. I'll be using alligator snapping turtles as a reference yet again, they're honestly so cool looking, so each segment of his shell will come to a point. Once I got the inside part of a shell all filled out, the border was looking a bit flat, so I added some more volume to that as well. Once that's blended in, I'm going to use some acetone to smooth out the entire shell. And with the shell done, pretty much all of his form is ready to go for texturing. At first, I was delirious enough to believe that adding hundreds and hundreds of warts by hand was the correct thing to do, but then I realized I'm a complete buffoon and I could just make some texture rollers. Now, I've never made texture rollers before, but they didn't look difficult to make. So I grabbed some toothpicks, covered them in clay, and began indenting a bunch of holes into them. I made a few versions of them with different textures, like this lizard skin one, as well as a couple different shapes and sizes so they'd be easier to use on different parts. Here's the moment of truth, this was me testing them out for the first time, and they worked perfectly. My plan was to layer up a few different textures, so the bumpy one, the lizard skin one, and then I also found this mesh bag that was holding some fruit, and I figured that would work really well for some more rough skin texture. And so it began. At first, I was too light with the pressure, as you can see, but once I got used to using them, it became really fun to see this naked mole rat turn into a turtle. Once that was all finished, I left his head to be the last thing I textured just because I wanted some good practice. The first thing I did was add some lines to his ears to make them look more like horns, and then I added some deeper scaling to the top of his head. His lips needed the opposite of Botox, so I went in and indented a bunch of lines into them. Then I very carefully used the rollers to add any finishing details. But when I finished that, I realized I had all those pre-cut pieces of clay that I planned on using for his skin that I no longer needed, until I looked at a picture of a turtle again and saw they have these little needly protrusions around their neck and grundle region, so all those pre-cut pieces ended up being used for that. Next up is getting his shell texture right, and I was very nervous for this part because I felt like if I messed up the shell, then the realism factor would leave this project faster than my dad going to get milk. So I took my time adding a bunch of ridges to each section with a ball stylus. Then using a rough brush, I textured the shell horizontally first, trying my best not to smush any of the ridges down. Once each segment of his shell was textured consistently, I went back in with an X-Acto knife for a few deeper horizontal lines. Once that was done, I went over each section again, but this time with vertical lines. For the outside rim of a shell, I used the same rough brush to add a bunch of lines to it, and I tried my best making sure they looked natural and cohesive. It definitely took a few passes to get each part just right, but it looks really good, and it's gonna look even better when we paint it. Next up on the texturing agenda are the barnacles, and for those I used a ball stylus, an X-Acto knife, and the rough brush. I also added some smaller barnacles on and around the big one just to blend it in with everything else. Then I could add some super big scales to Blastoise's arms. These are just half ovals that get super big in the center of his arms but get smaller and more tapered off as you get to the ends. I'm going to use an X-Acto knife and sculpting tool to rough up his stomach shell a bit, and while I'm in the area, I decided to add a few stray barnacles on his body. Then going back to the scales, they looked really bland, so I decided to give them some texture with one of my silicone tools. Alright, that wraps up sculpting our turtle, so let's throw him into an oven and get started on the base. base. I'm using a 99-cent piece of wood and bulking out the top a bit with foil and clay, making sure the base gets right up to his feet. We don't need to worry about the top for now, instead we're going to cover the entire edge of the base in lava rocks. I use foil to bulk out the inside of the rocks and attach them to the base. People with trypophobia, I'm sorry, but also don't look away, conquer your fears, don't let a rock best you. For the lava rock texture, I'm using a handful of tools to indent craters into the soft clay. This was very cathartic and satisfying, and once I was done, I went back over everything with a little plastic tool to press down any weird areas. Then I baked it and gave the entire thing a few coats of black. Then once everything was covered, I gave it a few dry brush layers of increasingly lighter grays. For the top part, I want it to look like sand, so as a base coat to cover up the black, I'm using this sand-colored paint paste that I had left over from another project. Once it had a few coats on, I decided to use some real sand to achieve the texture I wanted, so I smothered the entire top in Mod Podge and pressed the sand into it while it was still wet. I ended up doing a few coats of this just to make sure I got every area of the top covered. Okay, now it's time for the part that really brings this project to life, which is painting Blastoise. I'm using satin finish paints for this because I think it would look more realistic, and we're starting with all the yellowy beige areas of his body. And after those areas got a few coats of paint, it's time for the blue parts, and I wanted this turtle to be blue. So once I mixed up a shade I really liked, I began applying it to his body. And wherever the blue meets the yellow is where I'll use the most water to blend each side together. As for his head, the only place I really had to be careful around is his top lip. I wanted an ombre effect between the blue and yellow, so that part took a few coats of super thinned out paint. Next up is his shell, and the rim is getting several coats of white, and the rest of it is getting a few coats of an orangey brown. As for the barnacle pumps, they're getting many layers of ivory, and the inside of his mouth is getting a very deep purplish red. I also painted the bumps on his tongue a lighter color, but I did that off camera because I had to hold it like 2 centimeters away from my pupil to get it right. Now all his color is blocked in pretty much, but no creature looks like this, so it's time to start using dark washes to really bring out all the texture. For the yellow parts, I'm using a few coats of a brown wash. And for the blue parts, I use a super dark blue wash. Just like the yellow parts, I do a few coats more on any wrinkles to really bring out the depth. Here's a little before and after the blue wash. It's kind of hard to believe that one super easy step like this could make such a difference, but as a wise man once said, believe it. Now, once he looks fantastically grimy, I go over all his arm scales with a dark blue and blend them up so they look natural. Moving on to some more areas that need attention. For his water pumps, I'm using a light beige wash and some little accents of yellow. For the outer rim of his shell, I'm giving it the same beige wash, and the rest of his shell gets a very dark brownish black wash. To truly fulfill our quest to accentuate all this texture, we need to finish off with a dry brushing. So all of his blue areas will get a really light blue, his yellow areas get a really light yellow, and so on and so forth. Any fearsome man needs a manicure every once in a while, so I paint all of his nails an ivory color and use a light brown wash to make them look appropriately used and dirty. I paint all these small barnacles on his body white, and then it's time for his biblically accurate turtle eyes. They both get a base coat of pink with dark red lines around the perimeter. I add a dab of yellow on the center of each eye, and then on top of those, I paint on the pupil. And finally, I finish them off with some UV resin. And while I have it out, I'll use it to make the inside of his mouth look wet as well. Now, before I glue him onto the base, I realized the color of the sand just didn't look right against his super bright body, so I opted to paint over it with a lighter color. I glued him down to our base once that was done, and finally we're on the last step of this entire project. I want it to look like he's got a steady stream of water coming out of his pumps and running down his arms onto the sand. I cure 2 strips of resin on some parchment paper, and then I peel them off and attach them to each pump with more resin. Once they're on, I slowly go back over them and let the resin cascade naturally until I'm satisfied with how everything looks. But with that said, you've been very patient along this journey, and I think there's only one thing left to do. And as always, I have to thank all of my patrons, but especially my new DIYer, Awkward Burb, my new crafter, Virus Void, and my glorious new artificer, Kane Belmont, whose name is so cool it sounds like it's from a Castlevania game. So if you want to support the channel and get bestowed an official title like DIYer or crafter, as well as all of these glorious benefits, head on over to Patreon. Well, congratulations, you've made it this far into the video and have successfully beaten the TikTok brain allegations. If you have any recommendations for my next craft, be sure to leave them in the comments below, and I will see you next time.